What is clear is that the more affiliated and the more observant you are, the more likely you were to vote for Donald Trump. Israel is the center of world Jewish life. It is not the United States anymore. They do need American help, but we need their help too. One of the ways we need them, frankly, is to deepen the sense of peoplehood on the part of our children and grandchildren.
Hello, and welcome to Think Twice. This week we have an important conversation about the future of American Jewry and its connection to Israel with veteran diplomat and Tikvah Fund head Elliott Abrams. But before we start today's program, I want to remind you, as always, to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. Also, you don't have to wait a full week for more of our content. There is a Jonathan Tobin daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the Daily Show under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel, wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. Does it matter how American Jews voted in the presidential election? For both Jewish Democrats and Jewish Republicans, the answer is that it matters a great deal. The Democrats are asserting that Jewish support for the Democrats remains as high as in previous elections and wasn't affected by the war on Israel and the surge in antisemitism that followed the October 7, 2023 massacres of Israelis by Hamas terrorists. Republicans assert that a more thorough look at the exit polls shows that more Jews voted for President-elect Donald Trump than their opponents claim, and that this shows not only that the community's electoral loyalties are shifting, but that it was also a direct result of the Biden administration's ambivalent stand towards Israel war and Hamas, as well as the way the American political left largely abandoned the Jews in the wave of anti-Semitic pro-Hamas agitation on campuses and elsewhere in American society. It's not clear to me that the data that either side cites to back up their assertions is reliable, though I imagine that there was some movement to Trump, especially in states like New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Florida. But the key to solving this puzzle may depend more on your ideas about the makeup of the Jewish population than the skill of any pollster. The point being is that those Jews who do have a highly developed sense of Jewish peoplehood and are engaged with Israel were likely to be influenced by those issues, and the large number of those who don't weren't. But how many American Jews truly are impacted by these issues? The expectation that the wave of anti-Semitism, and especially the betrayal of Jews by liberals, left-wingers, and minority communities that were long assumed to be allies, would be something that could change the votes of Jews was probably at least in part mistaken. It may well be that those who do care about the fate of their community in Israel are galvanized by the issue of anti-Semitism. But if many of those who claim Jewish identity don't already care about the fate of the Jews or Israel, the mainstreaming of Jew hatred under the guise of sympathy for the Palestinians, or even woke ideological teachings that falsely label Jews and Israelis as white oppressors, won't make them start caring about the fate of their fellow Jews or impel them to be more involved in the Jewish community. That is why the decline in support for Israel among American Jews, especially young people, isn't so much a function of liberal and left-wing critiques of the Jewish state as it is one that is the product of demography. What then is the future of a Jewish community numbering millions of Americans, in which so many, at least outside of the minority who are religiously Orthodox, who fall into the category of what demographers call Jews of no religion, or what others call Jews in name only? Someone who has been thinking a great deal about this question is Elliott Abrams, whose newest book, If You Will It, Rebuilding Jewish Peoplehood for the 21st Century, takes a deep dive into the question of the implications of a demographic decline of American Jewry and what to do about it. And we're pleased to have him back with us today to discuss it. Elliott Abrams is a senior fellow for Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and chairman of the Tikvah Fund. He has had a long career in foreign policy, serving in the Reagan, George W. Bush, and Trump administrations, and is the author of several books, including Tested by Zion, the Bush Administration and the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, The Influence of Faith, and Faith or Fear, How Jews Can Survive in a Christian America. Elliott Abrams, welcome back to Think Twice.
Thanks very much.
Well, Elliott, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I want to start by asking about a recent controversy that isn't directly related to your book, but I think sort of plays into some of the discussion behind it. And that concerns the Jewish vote and whether it shifted away from the Democrats as a result of the post-October 7th surge in antisemitism. While political junkies and partisans care about which exits were accurate, if indeed any of them were, isn't the question about Jewish voting patterns and whether they were influenced by the war against Israel and anti-Semitism here in the United States, isn't it more about the makeup of American Jewry itself and whether, as you write in your new book, a lot of them care about these issues and have a sense of Jewish peoplehood in the first place?
I think that's right. That is, let me put it a different way. How did Jews vote? Well, the next question should be, of course, what do you mean Jew?
Exactly.
And, the national polls tell you nothing about that. There have been some more elaborate, detailed polls, and they suggest something unsurprising. If you ask people, what is your religion? Then some people who are sort of, Jews by heritage, but they don't affiliate, not only do they not practice, they do not affiliate, they may say no, and then they're out of the picture. What is clear is that the more affiliated and the more observant you are, the more likely you were to vote for Donald Trump. I know a lot of people will challenge that, but I might refer people to an interview that can be found on Mosaic website with a man named Litwack, who is a pollster who did detailed polls on, for example, Pennsylvania, and found, or says he found, that something like there would have been a 15% shift in the vote of Jews had Josh Shapiro been chosen as the running mate.
I'm a little skeptical about that, but
Yep.
okay.
Unclear, but if you look at, the best we can do may be to look at precincts, which is to say neighborhoods, and the ones that were most religious, that had the greatest percentage of Orthodox Jews, tended to be more Republican. I don't think that's very shocking because people who are most strongly affiliated, let's say, tend to be those who care most about Israel and about anti-Semitism.
Yeah, well, I guess the question is it a mistake to consider those with no active ties to other Jews or any interest in the Jewish community as Jewish for the purpose of defining how many Jews there are in the United States and what they think about Israel or anything else? I mean, clearly many secular and non-religious Jews still want to be identified as Jewish, even if they don't behave in the ways that Jews traditionally did or want to be part of the community. Shouldn't we count them, even if a lot of them are either only citing their background to bash Israel or to seek to redefine Jewish identity in ways that have little to do with traditional and transmissible characteristics of Jewish identity, or should we not?
Well, the Pew study, which is the largest in numbers, Jewish Americans in 2020, how did they count? Well, first of all, it's all self-reporting, right? They say, are you Jewish in any way? That's the question. Are you Jewish in any way? So you might say, well, one of my 4 grandparents was Jewish, so I guess so. You say yes, and they count you as a Jew. And then you turn up on all their statistics on what did Jews think about this? And what did Jews do about that? I think one really, to make those numbers meaningful, one has to go a little bit further. I mean, in my book, I mentioned Sergio della Pergola, Israeli demographer who's really maybe the best, I would say the best Jewish demographer now. And he says in the book, I was born in Trieste. I've been there once or twice since then. My children, who are all Israelis, he says, have never been there. They know that dad or grandpa was born in Trieste. It is meaningless. We don't want meaningless statistics, and I'm afraid that we get them from Pew and many other polls. So I think we have to be very careful when people say things like, what is the percentage of Jews who care about Israel? You have to define those Jews somehow. And obviously you find that the ones who are most observant and or affiliated in the sense that they belong to a Jewish organization, they belong to a synagogue, they give to a Jewish charity, are obviously much more likely to, for example, care about Israel. So in the numbers that Pew turned up, I mean, it's quite interesting because there are millions of Americans who trace somehow to a Jew back a generation or two who are no longer in any way Jewish. There are also many people whose only, I would say, active form of affiliation in their lives is that when Pew said, "Are you Jewish in any way?" they said, well, yeah, I guess. That's it. That's the only thing. So that's quite different from, for example, an observant Jew of whatever denomination who goes to synagogue at least every week and has been to Israel. I mean, you can take the question of have you been to Israel? The answer in Australia, for example, or France is about something like 85% of Jews have been at least once. Here, where tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of American Jews have been to Israel courtesy of birthright, the number is still only 45%. That's pretty low.
Yeah, it is. Well, however we define Jews, and obviously we're defining Jewish identity in a way that we don't any other ethnic religious group. But certainly throughout history, anti-Semitism helped keep Jewish communities together. And some assume today that the rise of left-wing Jew hatred that has become so obvious since October 7th, 2023, will do the same. Is that what has been happening in the last 13 months since the current war began?
That's a very good question. It's certainly true that Jewish communities, going back 1,000 years, were hermetically sealed in part not only by their own will, but by the anti-Semitism of their neighbors and the authorities. If you look back to, say, 1967-73 wars, many experts said this has changed the American Jewish community forever. And that was wrong. It hadn't. There was a blip. There was in, for example, identification as Jewish, in contributions to Israel and Jewish charity. And then it went right back down to normal. The question you're raising is a good question. Is this different this year? Because it's not just October 7th and the horror that was inflicted on Israelis. It's also anti-Semitism in the U.S. I would say I'm dubious that it changes a lot. There's not a lot of data. I think that's the first thing we need to say. It's going to take 5 years before we can say, I think, with certainty what's happened. But there's a sociologist at Tufts, Eitan Hirsch, who was studying Jewish students, for example, not only before October 7th, but also this year, 2024. What did he find? Nothing shocking in a way. What he found was that the reaction of Jewish students tends to be based on what they came to campus with. So students, what he calls high background. Did your family ever go to Israel? Do you ever celebrate Shabbat? Do you belong to a synagogue? Do you have a Seder? Does all of those questions, those with what he called high Jewish background become campus activists in much greater percentage, much greater, than those with what he called low Jewish background, whose answers to all those questions are no. They stand back. They look at it. They may not like it, what's going on campus, but they are much more likely to dissociate than to become campus activists. So, again, that's not very surprising, but it suggests to me that this anti-Semitism will not transform a generation of Jews. We started with the election, and that's another question. Will anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and the anti-Israel activity we see around the world lead some American Jews to change their votes? It did in Canada. It did in England when Jews switched to conservative. It did in France. It did in Australia. We were the outliers in the United States where Jews kept voting left. I don't think we have enough data to say that that's going to change now. I think we have enough data to say that there was a blip, there was a movement in the 2024 election. I'm not quite sure we know how big it was. There is some data that says, well, 21% of Jews voted for Trump. I think that's clearly wrong. The number is clearly higher. Maybe it's closer to 30. Others would argue, no, it's in the 40s. And even if it is, will it be repeated or is that a one-time thing? I don't think we know the answer to that.
Yeah, I think the point you make in the book, which I think is so powerful, is that while anti-Semitism and pressure from the outside, even really horrendous pressure, it can strengthen Jewish identity, as you say in that study you cited, among those who already have a strong Jewish identity, but it can't create a Jewish identity. And as far as, Jewish voting patterns, if Jews are, as the demographers say, Jews of no religion, don't have a strong Jewish identity or really much of one at all, then other things, are going to determine their votes. And, in a country, in a political culture where it's very clear that politics now plays the role that religion used to play in most people's lives. For Jews, if this election, the 2024 election was one in which, the real shift, the realignment, if indeed it was one, was between, the credentialed elites, the highly educated, and the working classes, with the working classes, now becoming, Republicans and the credentialed elites becoming almost uniformly Democrats. Well, obviously the Jews, who are very highly educated, portion of the country, and demographically so, they're going to stick with the Democrats because that's what's most important to them.
I think that's clear for the unaffiliated, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
I think that what we're talking about is, well, what about the others, whatever percentage of the Jewish community that is? We do know this. We know that the propensity to vote Republican is higher among the Orthodox. I don't know, for example, well, what about that portion of conservative Jewry that is highly observant? That portion of conservative Jewry, for example, that goes to synagogue every Shabbat. What about them? Do they vote like the Orthodox, or do they vote like conservative Jews who just simply belong to a conservative synagogue?
Speaking of conservative Judaism, the movement of conservative
Judaism movement, right? The denomination,
as opposed to political conservative,
right? Don't have any data on that,
and that's a really small part of the, that's a really small slice of an already small demographic, because adherents, conservative Judaism more or less imploded in the last half century, and it's now pretty small.
Yes, Reform Judaism is much, much larger now. As you said, 50 years ago, conservative Judaism was much larger. So it would be kind of odd, wouldn't it, to think that an unaffiliated Jew who may show up at a service once or twice a year or may not, who is intermarried, who is not raising his or her children as Jews, why would they switch party all of a sudden and vote Republican? And
they'll be like Doug Emhoff and just stay Democratic, right?
Well, and we do know that the intermarriage rate now among non-Orthodox Jews is in the 70s. It's over 70%. And we're talking here, when we use the term intermarried, we're talking about a situation where there was no conversion. Because if there was a conversion, it's not an intermarriage. And we have
Exactly.
very good data about the impact of conversion. And on almost anything you can measure, the families are pretty much the same as, let's say, born Jews. That is, support for Israel, for example, affiliation with a synagogue, belonging to a denomination. We're talking about those where there's no conversion, and all those numbers are much lower. So why would all of a sudden why would you convert, to a Republican in that situation? You won't.
Mhm. No matter what's happening with Israel or how much anti-Semitism is coming from the left, it's not really going to change them.
It would. I think much of the anti-Semitism, first of all, particularly the physical anti-Semitism, has long been directed at Orthodox Jews, or let's put it even now, or visibly,
Right.
people who are visibly Jews. Now, what happened on campuses is something new, because those Jews we've been talking about, who are unaffiliated, send their kids to the 100 best schools in America, and all of a sudden, there's anti-Semitism on those campuses. How are they going to react to that? Will there be a move away from those campuses? There's a little one. We can see it. Again, how large will it become, and will it last? I think we don't know the answer to those questions. Partly it depends on how the schools react. I mean, we've seen a real divergence where you've had, I would say, a very strong visible reaction at Vanderbilt, for example, Florida, for example, University of Florida, and a very poor reaction at, say, Harvard or Columbia.
So this is the distinction between the Ivy League and the Southeastern Conference.
It may be. I think in general,
Putting it in sports or football terms.
state universities are going to be better because they worry about the governor and the state legislature. There is a division among the Ivy League, but they've been pretty bad. But people talk about the I've forgotten the term now, but the schools that are kind of like Ivy League schools: Duke, Vanderbilt, Stanford, and they vary too to some degree in how they react. Again, I'd say, let's talk in 5 years. We'll see how this turns out.
Yeah. Well, many of those who write and think about American Jewry, especially in publications like the New York Times and left-wing Jewish outlets, take it as a given that any reported decline in Jewish support for Israel, and there certainly is a decline, I think most people agree about that, is a product of their disagreement with Israeli policies, or even with Zionism and the idea of a Jewish state. But while many American Jews are critical of Israel, isn't the problem really the one that we've just been talking about, which is to say demographics and assimilation rather than politics?
That's my view, and I think there's a lot of good data to support that view. That is, it's perfectly possible to be a strong Zionist and say, I have to tell you, I wouldn't vote for Likud right now, or to say, I think Netanyahu's a bad leader. That's not what's going on here. That's not what's happening. It's the affiliation question, once again. It's people who are not involved in Jewish collective life. So it's, again, we're generalizing here, and you and I will both know, and people listening to this will know, individuals and families that aren't like this. But the statistics show that.
Well, that's the thing about questions like intermarriage. So much of what the discussion is anecdotal rather than data-driven.
Exactly right. But the data does show on Israel that, again, what's the surprise here? People who don't belong to any denomination, who don't affiliate in any way, who don't give to Jewish charities, who haven't been to Israel, more than half American Jews, never once. They don't support Israel strongly. They don't care much about what's happening in Israel. Again, I mean, this is logical stuff. And it isn't because, that settlement was just expanded. That's not what's happening here. What's happening here is a general assimilation and disaffiliation, and all the statistics suggest that intermarriage has a great deal to do with it, to do with a decision to just move back somewhat from Jewish life, from Jewish collective communal life.
Yeah. I think also we have to acknowledge that the problem of assimilation or declining interest in Judaism, Jewish peoplehood in Israel, is one that is rooted in American freedom, as well as in the values of liberal Judaism, which in practice, if not in theory, as you wrote in your book, is not always, if not compatible with Jewish sectarianism, or let alone a Jewish state fighting a war of survival.
This is I'm glad you made this point. I mean, Irving Kristol once said that the problem Jews have now is Christians don't want to kill us, they want to marry us. It is about the greatness of America in many ways. We don't have Jewish ghettos in America. There's no forced affiliation if you wish to leave the community. We are not the only community having this problem. I mean, I view it as a problem, but this phenomenon. When I was a kid, Hollywood was making movies, and before I was born, Hollywood was making movies that showed the sort of classic big Italian immigrant or Irish immigrant family with 9 children. Well, those families are gone. Those ethnic groups, national groups, have assimilated so much that they're also now having 1 child or 1.8 children, or, this does show.
And not necessarily identifying or, with the ethnic identity that was so strong, that was so important to their
Each
grandparents.
American is less identified, and intermarriage. Marrying someone of a different national heritage or ethnic heritage. So, again, unsurprisingly, this is happening all over America. By the way, the disaffiliation from religion is also happening to Catholics. In the book, If You Will It, I mentioned something that Ross Douthat of the New York Times wrote about Catholics. There was a generation of people who were raised very Catholic, with very Catholic grandparents, maybe immigrant grandparents too. They were cradle Catholics. They may not practice now. They may not be observant, but they were cradle Catholics. But their children are not. Their children are kind of like the children of Jews who had an immigrant grandparent, but their children and grandchildren don't have any of that ethnic tie. They were born in a very open society in America, and they're drifting away. Again, you and I can both cite impressionistic evidence of families that, let's put it this way, did everything right. They took the kids to Israel, and they belonged to a synagogue, and they went, and they were kosher at home, and there's the son or daughter in Jewish Voice for Peace at the University of X or Y.
Or just having nothing to do with Jewish identity.
That will happen, but statistically, the likelihood is enormously diminished if the child is raised with a strong Jewish background. And in the book, I suggest there are 3 ways to do it very briefly: better Jewish education, Jewish summer camping, and time in Israel. Birthright, we know, has had an impact on tens of thousands of American Jews through its 10-day program, or as I sometimes put it, 10 lousy days. So think of what a semester of high school or college will do: a gap year before college, junior year abroad. Don't go to Barcelona. Go to Jerusalem. Any of these things. We have data on Jewish summer camping as well. It has a lasting impact for tens of thousands of Jews, because Jews 50, 75 years ago had it, and 100 years ago had a kind of immersive experience growing up as Jews in Jewish neighborhoods. That's gone. If you want to have an immersive Jewish experience for your children, living as Jews among Jews, you got to create it intentionally in a Jewish school or a Jewish summer camp or in Israel.
Well, I think this leads right into, my next question, which is the fact that you are among those who believe, among the many who believe that the relationship between Israel and the diaspora is now one in which the Jewish state can help Jews living elsewhere as much, if not more, than communities like the one in the United States can help Israel. But I think we should start with asking whether Israelis or most non-Orthodox American Jews, who are the overwhelming majority, the Orthodox are still a small minority in the United States, truly interested or even capable of having a two-way relationship.
Well, again, we're gonna find out over the next few years. If you take Pew's number of 7.5 million Jews, which I think is a silly number, because it's really reflecting people who have some Jewish heritage.
It's like people who say they're 132nd Cherokee.
Yes.
Not to be
Not
not
to
citing a
on
certain
a point.
U.S. senator. Yeah.
Millions of those people don't want to have that kind of relationship with Israel. But I think millions of American Jews do feel that way, or that feeling can be strengthened and deepened partly through time in Israel. Yeah, you got to work at it. I mean, I think, Sharansky, for example, is very, very supportive of the idea of gap year, which I think is a great idea. And it's something that's kind of now standard in the Orthodox communities. You do a year in Israel before you go on to university. It should be a wider practice, I think, in the U.S., as should the semester abroad. I think there are millions of American Jews who do feel very strongly about Israel. And I think they look at it now and realize that after a year of war, the threats are very, very great. I really do think this is a two-way relationship now where, that's absolutely obvious to Canadian and French and British and Australian and Argentine, etc. Jews. They understand it as a two-way relationship. For American Jews, we've felt for 100 years, no, 125 years, American Zionism was mostly foreign aid program. Yeah, these people are trying to build a Jewish state, these communities over there under the British mandate, and then trying to build up, actually before the Jewish mandate, and then trying to build up Israel, this poor country when it started, they had 600,000 Jews. We had millions of Jews. It's a foreign aid program. That's over. And now we have, I think, a relationship where, yes, they continue to need American support, and it's a point we got to make. We saw that in the last year. Israel needs American military support. This old formula, Israel has to be able to defend itself by itself against any combination of enemies. We are sadly past that. They do need American help against this combination of enemies. But we need their help too. Israel is the center of world Jewish life. It is not the United States anymore. Prior to the Holocaust, it was Europe. Since the Holocaust, it's been the United States. We've just reached the point, you can argue about what month that was, but the point where there are more Jews in Israel than in the United States, and that's going to widen over time because their birth rate is a lot better than the American Jewish birth rate.
By a lot.
Yes. As a matter of fact, they are the only country in the OECD that has a more than replacement birth rate. So we need them. And one of the ways we need them, frankly, is to deepen the sense of peoplehood on the part of our children and grandchildren. Because what can happen, I think, at a Jewish summer camp, sleepaway camp, and what can happen on a trip of some time to Israel is that the young person gets this sense, these are my people. This is who I am. And that's what Israel can do for us.
Yeah, well, we've been talking around, a basic fact about how assimilation is eating into the demography of American Jewry, and that the American Jewry is sort of contracting, declining. But does it matter if American Jewry is in a demographic decline? How will that fact impact the ability of those who choose to remain Jewish, or, as you just noted, in Israel that no longer depends on charity from the diaspora?
Well, I'd say two things. One, Jewish life in America. Two, Israel. Numbers help for Jewish life in America. I'm thinking about things like old age homes, community centers, um, uh, Jewish schools,
Or
uh,
even synagogues, because if you don't have
community
enough Jews.
schools and synagogues. So I think numbers matter. From that point of view, it would be wrong for an Orthodox Jew to say, well, my community is strong, but I don't care about the whatever it is, 85, 90% who are not Orthodox. That's a mistaken view. If you look at it from a narrow Orthodox point of view, you should want that larger community. And frankly, that's also maybe where you can recruit people, the reserve army for Orthodoxy. And then there's the question of support for Israel in the United States. Where has that support come from over the last few decades? Evangelicals, Jews, if you go back, say, 50 years, Democrats. We know that younger,
And now Republicans.
yes, but Republican support for Israel is growing, not diminishing.
Right.
But young Democrats' support for Israel is diminishing. Young evangelical support for Israel is diminishing. And to some extent, young Jews' support for Israel is diminishing, though that may be because they are on the left. So in my view, we need to pay attention to this question of what's the support base for Israel in the United States politically? And it's great that it's growing among Republicans generally, but it's a real problem to see young evangelicals and young Democrats, and again, to some extent, young Jews, turning away from Israel. Some of this is left-wing politics that is going to be hard to overcome. Some of it, as we've been talking about Jews, is a kind of disaffiliation that one has to point to their parents and families for to a substantial degree. In the case of evangelicals, it's a very interesting question. Why is that? I don't think there is one single answer to that, but a part of the answer is a deliberate, well-financed campaign to turn evangelicals against Israel. The Christ at the Crossroads program and many other programs that go into the evangelical churches with terribly biased propaganda to try to turn people against Israel. Part of it, I think, I can't prove this, but I think, is a view on the part of a lot of young evangelicals that there is an older generation that was not faithful, that was involved in financial scandals and sex scandals and political scandals, and they're kind of discredited. And one of the things they told younger evangelicals was that they should be supportive of Israel. And I think that there's a lot of discrediting of that generation, I think, and it's tragic from the point of view of support for Israel.
What, you've mentioned already what we should do to cultivate a stronger sense of Jewish identity for young Americans. And ever since the 1990 National Jewish Population Survey, when the heads of federations and Jewish organizations, their hair went on fire with the thought that nobody would be around to pay their salaries. And here we are 30 odd years later. But the solutions you highlight, education, day schools, better synagogue schools where they exist, camps, and trips to Israel, they've been discussed and supported to a much greater extent. But in the decades since then, since the 1990s, when this became a major talking point, in fact, I can recall that the first time I met you was at a conference in the late 1990s about school choice and how we could help people, afford Jewish education better. What have we learned from attempts to implement the plans to make Jewish schools better and more affordable, as well as efforts to bolster Jewish camps and increase the number of Jews who have visited Israel?
First, let me just say, you mentioned the 1990 National Jewish Population Survey, and everybody's hair was on fire. One of the reasons their hair was on fire was the incredible shock to learn that the intermarriage rate was 52%. And again, it's now well into the 70s, 72, 73. What have we learned about this? Well, one thing we learned is money is very important. Birthright has cost an enormous amount of money, but a small group of Jewish philanthropists launched it. Sheldon Adelson, Charles Bronfman, Michael Steinhardt. And it has made a huge difference, not for everybody who does it, obviously. 20 years later, about a third of the people who did Birthright have not been back to Israel, but 2/3 have. And in a number of cases, people say it has changed their lives. We know from some other experiments, for example, the late Bernie Marcus, the Marcus Foundation, gave grants so that people could start trying Jewish summer camp. And the idea was maybe you get hooked. There are some other experiments with day school and with other trips to Israel. For example, Sam's Foundation in Seattle started basically paying tuition for a while for day schools to see how elastic is demand. How we know that demand is inelastic for most Orthodox Jews. They're going to go to a Jewish day school. They're going to send their kids. But it's very elastic for non-Orthodox Jews. So what does it take? And we know that it takes some combination of money and quality. That is, they're not going to send their kids to a Jewish day school that is not a first-rate school. If a first-rate school is available, it might be a public school in some places. So we're learning that money is important, and therefore, I want to go back to your point about where we met 5,000 years ago. School
Not quite
choice,
that long, but it seems that way.
school choice depends partly on money. It isn't just a matter of saying you don't have to go to public school. That's been true here for 100 years in the United States since the Supreme Court decided case of Pierce versus Society of Sisters. And we've known for a century, the Amish can go to their schools and so on. If you look at the other major diaspora communities, Canada, France, Australia, UK, much higher percentage of kids goes to Jewish day school, at least at some point. Like maybe it's K-8 or something like that, or K-12. One of the reasons for that is money. In Canada, you get a very big tax deduction for the money you're paying to a Jewish day school. The theory being, well, if 75% of what's taught is secular, it's math, it's science, it's history, you should get a tax deduction for that. In Australia, there are payments directly to the schools. Each system is different, but there's a lot of ways in which the state helps you. We don't do that in the United States, or I should say we didn't do that in the United States very much. But state after state is starting with voucher programs. Florida, for example, there is a relationship between Florida's school voucher program, the number of Jews who are moving to Florida, and the new number of Orthodox day schools growing and non-Orthodox growing in Florida. So if you believe that this is going to hit the Supreme Court in the next 5 years or so, and that we're going to see a great expansion in the United States of the ability of parents to recapture some of their tax money that they're paying for public schools they may not be using, I think you will see an opportunity to increase the number of children who are going to Jewish schools. And they need not be Orthodox, by the way. I'm the chairman of Tikvah, Jewish Educational Philanthropy, NGO in New York. In September, we opened a school. We don't call it a Jewish day school. We call it a Jewish prep school. There are Jewish community schools around the country that are not, in many cases, strictly Orthodox, and that are doing quite well and that will be doing better, again, if there's more financial help. What we find in the case of summer camp is the upper quartile in income very often do not use summer camps because they have a summer home, they have a beach house, the family goes to Europe for a month, and the lower quartile in income don't because they can't afford it. It's the second and third, it's the middle 50% of Jews who have a greater propensity to send their kids to Jewish summer camp. Obviously, you'd pick up more people from the lowest quartile, and let's say the third quartile, if it weren't so expensive, if there were more help, if you are sending children or grandchildren to summer camp for a month or two, you know how immensely, I mean, it's something like $10,000, $7,000 a child, $6,500 a child. If you have two children, that's a lot of money. So what we've learned, I think, is the demand is elastic and money matters.
Yeah, well, I think that's certainly true. And as someone who is myself, a great advocate for day schools, for school choice, and for making, lowering the cost of Jewish living and making, Jewish schools available for all, all members of the community. But if there's anything I've learned in spending my adult life covering the Jewish community, and this is pushing back a little bit about something we both agree on, it is that there is a considerable portion of the American Jewish community that not only wouldn't go if it was free, wouldn't send their kids even if it was free, you couldn't pay them to send their kids to a Jewish school. And this goes to the question of assimilation and what it means to be a Jew. I mean, that's, even if we clear the hurdle of making these schools more affordable and making them better, we're still dealing with a community, a large portion of which, as the demographers say, are Jews of no religion and who have little ties. And even those who have some ties are very uncomfortable with, the sort of strong Jewish sectarianism involved in sending their kids to a Jewish day school.
Well, I think the barriers to entry there are higher than for Jewish summer camping. Because for many families, the kids are going to go do something during the summer. They're maybe going to go to camp during the summer. So you have to choose what kind of camp. And I think that will be a little bit easier. I think we've seen in New York with Tikvah School, Emet, that some of the parents, this is an experiment, again, we'll know better in 5 years, but some of the kids are coming from the fanciest secular private schools, because at this point, those schools are so anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist that even parents who are not Orthodox, certainly, they can't take it anymore. I mean, they can't believe what's happening to their children every day. So we need to see how this rolls out. Again, maybe you're one of those not particularly affiliated families, but do you really want your kid to have a college experience that is pervaded by anti-Semitism and battles on campus and being told, we don't want you in that fraternity or sorority or club or dorm unless you're willing to attack Israel and Zionism? Really? Do you really want that? So, look, I'm not particularly optimistic, I would say. I think we know what to do. And the question is, what portion of the American Jewish community today, broadly defined, cares enough to do those things? And what portion is just going to kind of fade away? And again, we talked about anecdotal evidence. I certainly know plenty of people who have maybe 2 Jewish grandparents and often 4 Jewish grandparents, and their children are not being raised as Jews. The one thing I think we can say about them is they're probably not going to be anti-Semites because they know, grandma or grandpa was Jewish. But many of them are lost from the community. But there are millions of Jews who aren't lost. And we know what can be done to strengthen their sense of, and particularly their children's and grandchildren's sense of Jewish identity and Jewish peoplehood. And the question is, okay, are we going to do it?
Yeah, I think that's true.
Let
Now,
me
I
just
think
tell you
that
a story.
Go ahead.
Second, it's in the book, if you will it, about the Duke of Wellington. He came from a not particularly high family, good family, but
In Ireland,
yeah, I mean,
not in England.
low-ranking Irish purism. And then he became the Duke of Wellington after the victories over Napoleon. And at some fancy dinner, a woman seated next to him said to him, Duke, from whom are you descended? And Wellington replied, Madam, I am not a descendant. I am an ancestor. And in a way, what we're saying here is every Jew in America is a descendant of thousands of years of Jews, hundreds of generations. The question for them and us is, yes, but will you be an ancestor to more generations of Jews? You know what you need to do. Are you going to do it?
Yeah. Well, our discussion of what the choices that Jewish parents are forced to make now leads into my next question, which is, it's clear that many, if not most, of American educational institutions have been infected by woke ideology and the anti-Semitism it fuels. But aside from a few alternatives that have recently been founded, at the university level, the experiment in Austin, the University of Austin, or Tikvah's creation of the Emet Classical Academy for 5th to 12th graders in New York, what options do Jewish parents really have? And how can they be weaned away from thinking that sending their kids to places where anti-Jewish attitudes still prevail is the only choice for them, especially if they want them to succeed? Sending your kid to Harvard is, supposed to be the path to success. They all aspire to it. Will anti-Semitism change that, or can it change it?
We don't know the answer to that for sure. My personal guess is that kids who get admitted to the top prestige schools are still going to go there. But at the next level down, I think there are people who will look at parents and children who will look at the strife, the anti-Semitism, the anti-Zionism on a lot of campuses and say, what do I want that for? When there are places, you mentioned University of Austin, I would say University of Texas at Austin, University of Florida, which is now opening a kind of honors college, Hamilton College. There are Vanderbilt, which has been really tough on the question of campus anti-Semitism. There are many others. So there are choices. And I think that for the first time, what parents have to look at is not just the prestige and the U.S. News and World Report rating, but what will the experience of my Jewish child be on that campus? What will parents do about day schools, public schools, community schools? In some cases, they're going to have to create alternatives. And at Tikvah, we've had a number of groups come to us from different cities around the country to say, how do we open a school like this here in name the city? And in other places, in public schools, you're going to have to fight. We have all seen in a number of public school systems a kind of infestation of anti-Semitism, and it comes in no small part from faculty members, which is the same thing as has happened in many colleges.
The teachers' unions. Let's
Yes, the teachers'
call.
unions. And what Jewish parents have to do is fight. And that's going to be hard because the teachers' unions very often are the ones who are supporting politicians. But look, one of the things that I guess we're saying is Jewish identity in America today, particularly for the non-Orthodox, we're not an immigrant generation of 100 years ago or pre-World War II. You're going to have to do something. It has to be intentional. And part of it is going to be fighting in the universities, and part of it may have to be fighting in the elementary schools and the junior high schools and the high schools.
Well, I think we've seen, especially in the last year, that the two trends of 21st century American Jewish life, increased assimilation and distancing from Israel, from Jews who reject or don't care about Judaism and Jewish peoplehood, and an intensifying of Jewish identity among the religious and Zionists, are both continuing even after October 7th. And I guess the question is, which of them ultimately prevails? Or is it that both will, and that, sort of the two ships passing in the night, whether the Jews who are abandoning, Jewish identity effectively, and the Jews who are embracing it, even if they're smaller, that these will both continue. And the question is, which do we wish to strengthen?
Yeah, I think myself that the Jewish community, as a meaningful community that is not asking who is your grandfather, but asking who are you? How do you live your life? I think in that sense, the Jewish community will diminish in size, partly through assimilation, partly through intermarriage. But the Orthodox part of it will grow. And I think the Zionist part of it will grow because, as you're saying, there'll be a kind of bifurcation here. And what we need to do is make sure that the intentionally, willfully Jewish part grows and has the resources it needs to grow.
Well, I think you're right about that. Elliott, thanks so much for joining us today. I highly recommend, if you will, it to our audience. It's a good book, a very important book about a very important subject. And to learn more about the Tikvah Fund, you can go to tikvahfund.org. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition. And whether you're listening to us on Apple, Google Play, Spotify, or any of the other podcast platforms, or YouTube Music, or watching us live on Facebook or Twitter, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to Think Twice. Click on the bell for notifications and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen and watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.